Tull from the Irish Politics newsletter, here with Vince Martin in America from Wall Street and Maine. And today, and likely not for the last time, we're going to talk about Donald Trump. But first, Vince, we're going to start with a bit of an update from our last episode.
That's right, Tull. Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening. We closed that last episode by discussing what looked like the beginning of a little bit of a pressure campaign on Ireland around issues of neutrality, defense, trade, Israel-Palestine, and another shot was fired, so to speak, with another op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on Sunday.
Vince, do you want to sum up the article? Do you want to give me your thoughts on this from an American's point of view?
We talked last week about another op-ed in the Journal by Robert O'Brien, who was part of the first-term Trump administration. This article is actually written by Brit, Dominic Green, and it's a lot longer, it's more detailed, and a lot more critical. It really hits all the buttons, criticizes anti-Semitism in Ireland, the country's leadership, immigration policy, the economy. It says Ireland, quote, demands the surrender of Northern Ireland, which I know some Irish readers took exception to. It raises questions that we talked about previously about the attitude of U.S. Republicans toward Ireland. So again, it just hits all the buttons. And he even says that Dublin was formerly, quote, a dirty backwater, which I don't think was very effective in endearing him to Irish readers.
Yes, well, Dominic Green, he's a British historian and he writes for The Spectator and The Economist and a few other publications as well as the Wall Street Journal. But he's written a lot of anti-Irish articles over the years, an awful lot. I think about 6 or 7 in the last 2 years alone. So he has form here, and he, somebody might call him an Irish baiter. He's winding Irish people up as a profession. Can you tell me about the Wall Street Journal? What kind of publication is it? Add some context there for us.
Well, my take at the end of our last episode, which was slightly tongue-in-cheek but mostly serious, I said that being pale and lovable is what was keeping Ireland out of Trump's firing line. And I admit, if you read that article, it does sound a little bit like that meme you've seen online from The Naked Gun with Frank Drebin shouting, "Nothing to see here," while the fireworks factory is exploding in the background. What I would say, if you wanted to see this as part of a campaign coming from the Trump administration itself, the Wall Street Journal, which is, as the name suggests, very business-focused, it's been pretty anti-Trump over the last decade. They're much more traditional Republicans than he is. They're Romney Republicans, not Trump Republicans. They're kind of classic small C conservatives. So tying this to Trump, I think, is difficult. The other point I would make is that Trump's base is probably not reading the Wall Street Journal.
Are you saying Trump's base IQ is below a certain level?
Not in public. No, I'm not saying that, but it's just more a matter of meeting the base where they are. And on a Sunday in particular, I don't think his base is reading the Wall Street Journal. They're reading their Trump Bibles and Deep State Monthly, right? It's a joke, I swear. We'll make fun of Democrats too when and if they ever do something worth talking about. But
unlikely, yeah.
Yeah, that might be a while. But in all seriousness, the Journal, it's business focused. It's for business leaders. It's not pro-Trump. So to me, it's like the think tank report you highlighted last week, where it's something that's written for politicians, for diplomats, and maybe some of the executives of the multinationals that have major presences in Ireland. It's not written for the base. Because as I said last week, I still don't believe Trump's base is going to rally behind a punishment for Ireland over Israel. And I'd add one more point, that it being in the Journal means that it's not written for Trump. If they wanted to get a message to Trump, there would be more accurate and efficient ways to do that, the most notable of which would be by getting people on Fox News. That seems like a joke, but it probably isn't. So relative to what I said last week, I still stand by it. It does feel like there's a little bit of a campaign coming, but it doesn't feel like it's a campaign that's coming from D.C. or from the Trump administration. I think it's the other way. It feels like a campaign trying to influence the administration rather than the administration trying to influence the public.
Yeah, look, as I said to you, the Green, as a historian, has a long history of trashing Ireland on behalf of very kind of, I suppose, what people call centre-right or right-wing financial publications. But the Wall Street Journal are churning out these articles, and they're strongly, critical of Ireland and its government. They all have the same similar tone. They're all harping on about the same thing. that Ireland needs a lesson in grown-up geopolitics pieces. And you're right, it's probably not the sound of administration taking a target. It's the sound of a donor class and the think tank lads, gently clearing their throats and saying, "Dear Washington, have you noticed this little tax and tech Frankenstein out in the North Atlantic?" There's an element of that. Look at Ireland. Look at what Ireland's doing. They're pointing at Ireland. Donald Trump, to have a look at these guys. Like, what are they at?
We're not anywhere near that level, but there's a little bit of Iraq in 2002 feel to it, also, isn't there?
Yeah, there's all these pressure piece articles. I mean, like, no one's saying regime change or anything like that. We're just saying that, this quirky little country might be a strategic problem that needs a firm talking to, and a bit of like financial waterboarding. I mean, but there is a voluminous level of critique coming out of media publications in the USA recently, and and the Irish government should be worried. I mean, the Irish government is under siege now at the moment, and this is something we'll come to in future episodes. They're under siege internationally they're coming under pressure from Wall Street Journal think tank pieces, and they're under huge amount of pressure domestically. And Germans will tell you can't find a war on two fronts.
Yeah, so, I mean, I sympathize with that, certainly. It's a lot easier for me to sit in an American suburb and kind of say, hey, it's fine, let it go. But certainly, as you say, the pressure is rising, and you do wonder at some point if this continues, it may well get the ear of people who matter a little more than think tank analysts and op-ed writers. With that update done, we're going to pivot back to the topic of today's episode. As you called him in our pilot, our very first episode, the unavoidable Donald Trump.
Yeah, it kind of seems almost arrogant to do an episode about Trump, doesn't it, Vince?
It does a little bit, just because over the last 10 years, I mean, no one in the world has had more words written and spoken about them than Donald Trump. It's not even close. I don't even know who number two would be. I guess Vladimir Putin, maybe?
Probably Zelensky would want the word. Taylor Swift, probably.
Taylor Swift might be right.
Yeah, one of those two would give him a run for his money.
But it's still a very, very distant second for sure. And given that kind of just constant coverage, as we were setting up for this podcast and for this episode, you do kind of have a sense that there's nothing you can say about Trump that hasn't already been said, what's going to be fresh or what's going to be interesting, right?
But, there has been a lot of coverage, but at the same time, he's the perfect topic for our podcast. Because as we discussed in our first episode, the point here is different perspectives, an Irish perspective and an American perspective, and see if we can meet somewhere in the middle, see if there's commonalities there in our assessment of him. But here in Ireland and Europe, generally, there's a sense of bewilderment as to how Trump was elected to a second term in the first place. I mean, how did the Democrats just mess this one up so much? I mean, how, And over here in Ireland and Europe, we don't have a sense of why he's been so popular in America and in American politics, despite all the scandals and a career that was seemingly over 5 years ago. I mean, his political career was over 5 years ago. He was written off. He was goodbye, good luck.
Completely written off. He couldn't even open a checking account, let alone run for president. It really is a staggering comeback. And I think from our side, and we discussed this in the pilot as well, we still don't have a great perspective on how Trump is perceived outside the U.S. So I think Americans are going to be interested in that. And I know Irish listeners are interested in Trump just because I've been in a lot of Irish pubs, and when people hear my accent, I usually get two questions. And the first is, what state are you from? And the second is almost always, what do you think of Trump?
There are a lot of questions that's mostly unanswered. How do you find Trumpism? Is Trump himself intelligent? And if so, in what ways? Is the constant lurching from position to position that we've seen in the second term, is that planned? Is that what is that? Does anybody know? Is there an overriding strategy there, or is it just pure impulsiveness and recklessness, and he's just going with his gut and he's not thinking things out,
Yeah, I think those questions, even as an American, are unanswered. 10 years into this version of his political career, he's still kind of a character. And the outline of that character very much depends on what perspective that you take. Do you feel like that in Ireland and in Europe more broadly, that same sense holds?
Yeah, it does actually. Yeah, on some levels, it definitely certainly does. Trump is still less a politician and more kind of international Rorschach test. You know what a Rorschach test is, Vince?
I do, yeah. It's
Yeah,
for the
it's that.
shrinks.
It's
Yeah.
that. Yeah, it's for the shrinks. The blob. They show you a blob, and you go, "What's that?" That's a pair of breasts, and they show you another blob, and what's that? That's somebody's backside, or another blob. What's that? That's Donald Trump. That's clearly you're obvious. That's Donald Trump, of course. Yeah.
You're going to be
You know,
diagnosed as a very sick man if those are the answers that you're
I know. Be diagnosed with some kind of pervert or the like. Look, the point of those tests is everyone sees what they want to see, and usually says more about them than him. Oh no,
Absolutely, yeah.
But in Ireland, Trump is broadly unpopular. You know, he really is, especially at the level of mainstream public opinion and media. And that's mainstream media now. So there's people at the fringes of the media, you know, who would have a lot of sympathy for him and would support him. And then there's a bit of contrarian pushback as well. It's often framed around economics, law and order, politics, or anti-woke sentiment. But, you know, I don't buy the law and order shtick from people who give Trump a free pass on that, you know. I suppose the dominant image is a mix of moral disapproval and we'll be guilty of this as well as media caricature and I suppose anxiety for what his policies mean for the Irish economy, you know. And Europe's view is broadly similar to Ireland's also. I suppose to the French, he's what happens when you let people eat too much McDonald's, and to the Germans who've been here before, like maybe proof that democracy probably needs a warning label of some sort, you know. And I suppose right now in Europe, there's a realization the USA under Trump is pulling back from Europe, and Trump is planning to let Europe fend for itself against Russia, and it's going to try and force Ukraine into accepting a humiliating ceasefire. So Trump's problem with the EU, of course, is that it won't personally enrich the Trump family, and that's his animus against the EU. Essentially, you know, he can make money out of Russia, he can make money out of Ukraine, he can make money out of China, but the EU's not, you know, playing ball with him in that sense.
I think that's part of it. I will say, you know, if you look at his biography, he has had a bone to pick with Europe for decades now. I mean, his belief in free trade does go back to the 80s. He was talking about it even when he was riding high as a businessman, so to speak. But even that, I mean, that just gets to our point about kind of, you know, how are you going to view this? What is your perspective? So much of it is contested and so much of it is up for debate and not really understood. Even his biography is contested and people have views which literally can't be reconciled, right?
Yeah, I look, one side said he's a successful billionaire and politician, and he's had all manner of success in life, and to others he's a fraud and a con man with multiple bankruptcies with a predilection for young girls. You know?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, they literally just can't be both. And yet, to most people, certainly in the U.S. and my sense is globally, he actually is seen as one or the other. And in that sense, it does seem strange that we're going to try and add something to this conversation that's been going on for so long and so loudly. But that does get to the idea that there are just so many questions about Trump as a person and as a president that have really received bizarrely little coverage, given that he's been a major political figure for a decade and given that people, I think, really are interested in the answers to those questions.
How does that happen?
I think it does start with the biography. One big factor there is just that he's been around for so long. His first profile in the New York Times is in 1973. So more than 50 years ago, incredibly enough. The Art of the Deal, which is a best-selling book that he wrote about his negotiating style, which kind of cemented his reputation as this shrewd, self-made billionaire businessman. That's published in 1987. I remember his divorce being in the news because I grew up outside New York City. My dad used to bring home the New York tabloids, and Trump was splashed across those almost every day. That was the late 1980s. The Apprentice launched in 2002. I mean, that's still almost a quarter century ago now. So,
never watched it. Don't know.
Yeah. Is there an Irish version? Or
there was, yes. Yeah. There's, the Irish version was a cheap knockoff version, like the Wish version, the Wish version of The Apprentice or something. Something you might order from China.
So when Trump runs for president in 2015, he's been a public figure for 4 decades. He's been a national figure for probably a quarter century. He's had his own show for over a decade. And these things all build his brand, which is, he's a brash, he's talkative, he's successful billionaire. But importantly, the brand is not just that he's a billionaire and that he's successful. The brand, again, because of the art of the deal, is based on the idea that he's successful because he's shrewd, because he negotiates, because he reads people. He's not a software entrepreneur or something like that. It is a brand based on the fact that essentially he personally is outwitting everyone. And everything, I think, in his career runs downstream of that. And in the mind of the public and in terms of the political narrative, by the time he runs in 2015, the brand's pretty widely believed. And so there's no oxygen for any alternative explanation or kind of real nuance to the story of his career and his biography.
You're probably right to start with the biography, because I suspect a lot of Trump's ideology could be found in the biography. He's not a politician who later went on and became famous. He was a celebrity who accidentally wandered into politics. I suppose the way a drunk tourist wanders into the wrong hotel kind of thing, and ends up giving a keynote address or something. And I suppose that's the point you're making. Once the persona has been laminated into the public imagination for that long, facts don't really matter. Facts kind of they're an optional extra, whether you believe them or not. I've seen a couple of articles in Ireland that maybe do add a bit of nuance to it. Does the American media do that?
Yeah, the media tries. I don't want this to be a thing where we're acting as if the media isn't paying attention or we're saying, quote, we're telling the real story, because on podcasts and social media, that often leads to some pretty ugly places, right?
Yeah, look, the media won't tell you that COVID vaccines give you syphilis, right? And I read that on X. And, if you're looking for us, just put in the Atlantic Current podcast and you will find us on X.
That's true. Yeah, we're swimming in the cesspool. But, yeah. I mean, in all seriousness, when he runs for president in 2015, there's a lot of analysis of his business history. After he wins, the publishing industry here in America actually talks about a Trump bump because there are so many books being written about him. 2018, New York Times breaks a story that while Trump had been saying for years that he had received just a small in quotes, I guess, $1 million loan from his father, he had over time actually received well over $400 million in present day dollars. But again, he's been a national figure for 4 decades. And during those 4 decades, he's establishing his narrative. And for various reasons, the media is pretty happy to play along. They just don't challenge him. In that 2018 articles, actually, the New York Times writes that they quote Trump saying, quote, "I built what I built myself." And the article calls that, quote, a narrative that was long amplified by often credulous coverage from news organizations, including the Times. I mean, the Times is saying basically, yeah, we were part of this too.
Yeah, so like by 2018 or even 2015, I suppose it's pretty much too late to change the story as far as Americans are concerned, I think. And once he becomes president, everything becomes purely political. So it's a binary thing. It's a zero-sum game. You either believe him or you don't.
And even the organizations that are trying to have some balance, that are trying to have journalistic standards, if it's the New York Times, they wind up in that structure where paragraph 3, they're quoting a supporter, and paragraph 5 is a critic, and you get to the end of the article and there's no conclusion. And then if you are on those sites that lean either left or right, they're just going to be in their preferred narrative. And to make matters worse, particularly since, the beginning of his first term, you just have the fact that he just generates so much news that any kind of measured story or deeper analysis or nuance, there's just not even room for it to take hold, right?
Flooding the zone with Steve Bannon put it.
Yeah, it's a famous quote, yeah.
It's where political actors push a rapid, constant stream of announcements, controversies and claims, so opponents, media and the public never have the time to focus on any one thing or build sustained pressure to put the politician, under the cosh, so to speak. And I think Steve Bannon framed it bluntly as overwhelming the media, so they're forced to fixate on one story while 1,000 stories are happening somewhere else about him. people tune out because they're exhausted or they're confused and they don't know what to believe anymore. I mean, I suppose the core idea is volume and tempo. Keep producing new policies, new scandals, new statements, new narratives faster than, your critics can investigate them or fact check them or organize a proper resistance around. And you can see that at the moment with Democrats, they don't know what to do. There's so much just coming out of the White House. They can't get organized properly. So the zone has been flooded. And this is not something new or something Bannon or Trump invented. They just kind of hyperscaled it via social media. And it's working, and it's working in real time. We're seeing this at the moment. Nobody can get organized against Trump, whether it's Europe, the Democrats, Ukraine, financial institutions. You take your pick because there's a new policy or there's a new announcement every, 2 hours.
Yeah, it does seem like that. In a normal presidency, something big happens, right? Once or twice a week. And so if you have some of these more nuanced pieces that maybe are trying to change perspective or change the narrative, they might go up on a Wednesday, and then cable news can pick it up. The Wall Street Journal op-ed page can chime in. And that take can become part of the narrative. And to your point, there's just no airspace for that. And I think that does add to the kind of binary characters we have when, usually the case is that the truth is somewhat in the middle. And we're kind of going down this path to say that we're going to talk about Trump quite a bit. And it's not just because, he is unavoidable, as you put it in the first episode. I think it's actually because there's just a huge amount to discuss if you get out of that left-right supporter-critic structure. But we'll start in our wheelhouse, as we say over here, and try to get a sense of the differing perspectives in the U.S., Ireland, and on the continent. And I'm going to start with Ireland, Tull. Let's assume that the U.S. Congress says, look, we know that the American presidency has an effect on everyone in the world, essentially, and so we're going to let everyone in the world vote.
Ireland would, of course, be flattered to be asked, I'd imagine. Normally, when America wants something from Ireland, it involves a Shannon stopover, for a plane on the way to Iraq or Iran, or, maybe a tax arrangement for a multinational, sweetheart deal for Apple or maybe something like that. If we wouldn't be used to being asked to vote for somebody,
We're not usually asking anyone for their opinion either, but if hypothetically Irish citizens could vote for the U.S. president, what percentage of the Irish vote do you think Donald Trump would have received in November 2024?
I think my own gut instinct is probably somewhere between 20 and 25%. I think Irish people would have voted for him. Okay. But we do have some hard data as I'm looking up live online at the moment. And the last time somebody did a poll like this was the Sunday Independent Ireland Thinks, and they said 16% of people in Ireland would vote for Donald Trump. Right?
Okay.
And 16%.
Yeah, that's pretty low. But as we've learned here, Trump always outperforms his polls. So I think that probably provides some support for your 20% plus figure. But regardless, that's still pretty low. Is that because of the personal nature of politics in Ireland? Is that a policy disagreement? What explains that lack of popularity?
Well, you might think it's lack of popularity, but no, we have to add a caveat here. We have different electoral systems, of course. But so Trump polling at 16% in Ireland is actually quite good, would you believe? Because Fine Gael, a party, one of the main parties in coalition government at the moment, is polling at 17%. So, 16% will be enough to help you form a coalition government in Ireland. It'd get Trump into power anyway on some level.
Maybe that's what everyone means about Trump's third term, right? He'll retire to Doonbeg and join an Irish coalition government. So outside Ireland, who's right? The Trump supporters who say he has jump-started the continent out of complacency, or the critics who say he's destroyed relationships with our key allies?
The answers are more complicated than people think. As you said, Trump fans insist he's jump-started Europe out of complacency, and there's an element of truth in that. Yes, of course there is. He's shouted at NATO, he's insulted most of Europe at some stage, and generally behaves like a man who thinks geography is one of those deep state hoaxes or, QAnon conspiracy. So the theory goes, of the doctrine is, he's, by threatening to walk away from alliances, he's forced Europe to spend more on defence, and this is true. Europe has upped its defence spending, even Ireland has. And, he's after forcing Europe to rethink their dependence on American growth politically. So there's truth in this when Trump fans say he's jump-started us out of complacency. There's it's the same kind of truth in saying that a house fire encourages the family to consider, getting better smoke alarms or the like.
Yeah, and in your metaphor, Trump supporters think he's a smoke alarm and his critics believe he's a house fire, right?
Yeah, and his critics will tell you he's wrecked relationships with key allies, and they're also correct. And again, with Trump, it's not black and white, and things are always far more complicated. And the transatlantic relationship used to be a sort of an arranged marriage, but an affection kind of grew over time, and there were shared values and there were common goals, and the arguments were over trivial things. And I suppose under Trump it started to look more like a reality TV verse, the public screaming matches, there's a policy reversals and constant threat of one party's going to run off with somebody else kind of thing,
Yeah, I think that's a great metaphor because there's a real sense on the American left, and I imagine in parts of Europe as well, that this is just a betrayal. It's a betrayal of a long-lasting and meaningful relationship, even if, to your point, it might not have been true love at the beginning.
Yeah, and damage is not just hurt feelings. It's the realization in European capitals that American foreign policy now swings whatever way the president happens to be blowing on a Tuesday morning. So the uncomfortable answer is that Europe has been thrown out of the bed and down the stairs, for want of a better turn of phrase. But Europe is spending more on the military. We are talking a big game about strategic autonomy. We're looking nervously at the map to see what happens in Washington in case Trump goes off his meds, I suppose. But this isn't a carefully designed wake-up call. It's the survival response of people who realise the pilot is trying to fly the plane while he's live tweeting the turbulence. Europe's complacency was a problem before Trump, and it's going to be a problem after him as well. I mean, the Allies' trust, once broken, is not going to be easily repaired with any future American president who kind of speaks in complete sentences and remembers where Estonia is. It's not going to be fixed that easily.
You don't think if a Democrat wins in 2028 that things will just go back to the way they were before?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the mood music started to change in Europe's relationship with the USA under the Obama administration. They were looking for Europe to stand on its own 2 feet at the time,
Yeah, that's fair. And I think even if you go back before that, I believe it was in 2003, it was Donald Rumsfeld, who was the defense secretary under Bush. He very famously talked about the difference between old Europe and new Europe and made pretty clear that his administration wanted to be on the side of new Europe.
Yeah, and look, Trump didn't invent the tensions. He just dialed the volume up, as you say, in America and kind of threw an amplifier at the EU. His supporters are looking at the increased defence budgets and they're calling it leadership and, 4D chess and all that kind of stuff. But his critics see the alliance, the alliance falling apart as an act of geopolitical vandalism. The honest description is probably something closer to a smash and grab intervention in the world order. Occasionally it's effective, but more often it's kind of reckless,
Wow, how about that? Yeah, that's a great way, really fascinating way to put it.
Okay, let's reverse the view here. We know that Trump is not so popular in Ireland and Europe, but he does have a large, loud base in the States. How much of that base is Irish-American?
To be honest, it's hard to tell. There was one poll in 2020 that said Biden won Irish Americans 52-39. There's a survey cited by a historian named Ted Smith that in 2023, 48% of Irish Americans are Democrats, 38% Republican, 15% Independent. I actually tried to look and find polling for 2024. I couldn't find too much that was reliable. Given the trends across those elections, I think you'd say that in 2024, Harris probably it's something like 50-45 in favor of Harris.
That's Kamala Harris, not Simon Harris, the Taoiseach of Ireland, right?
Yeah, I think Simon Harris would have done much, much worse, given what I understand. But the one caveat I would have with this question is that what an Irish American is nowadays is pretty different. It's much more of a mixed heritage group. My wife is pretty much 100% Irish, but as she's fond of reminding me, I am not. And the number of Irish Americans who grow up in Irish neighborhoods or even, cities with large Irish populations is a lot lower. The days of the Irish kind of being New York, Boston, Chicago, and a smattering of other cities. That's just changed. So even relative to how I grew up in the 1980s, 1990s, it's a different experience. But with that caveat, it does look like Irish Americans are probably about 50-50, depending on the year and the candidate, which obviously is quite a bit different from where Irish Americans were a few decades ago.
Well, why and how has that changed?
I think there's a couple of reasons. A simple reason is Irish Americans have more money. That doesn't necessarily mean you move right, but self-interest does matter. Right generally is favor of lower taxes. Irish Americans are much more white collar than blue collar, so there's a lot lower union membership. Unions historically have been tied to the Democratic Party, so that's kind of one broad factor as well.
They're not new trends in America. It's been going that way for a long time now, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you go back to 84, Reagan won the biggest landslide in history in terms of how many electoral votes he won. And the trend that political scientists talked about at the time was what were known as Reagan Democrats, which were kind of blue-collar former Democrats who crossed over to support Reagan. There's a lot of evidence that Irish Catholics were a big part of that group. And I think in general, you talked last episode and in the pilot as well about Ireland being largely secular and to the left. Irish Americans just haven't really ever been that way. The Irish in New York City, for instance, they were all Democrats, but that's not because they didn't believe in small government. It's because that's where the political machine was. You know, John F. Kennedy was not a liberal. He was a tax-cutting anti-communist who believed pretty strongly in American power. So I think there's always been a more conservative streak among Irish Americans than traditional Democrat, Republican labels might suggest.
I mean, there's a strong conservative streak going through Irish politics as well. You know, national politics there. There's always been that strong undercurrent. Was religion a big part of it, or if any?
Probably more than you might think. In the U.S., there's this kind of odd lingering political power, even among people who aren't necessarily, quote, religious, and it's certainly probably larger than the day-to-day influence. I mean, if you go back to when Biden was vice president, he came out in favor of gay marriage in 2012, and that was a big deal in part because Obama himself still hadn't come out in favor of gay marriage, which looking back is absolutely insane, isn't it? That 13 years ago, a Democratic president was not publicly in favor of gay marriage. I mean, how fast the world has changed.
Yeah, I mean, at that time we were gearing up to legalize same-sex marriage in Ireland. That Obama had even come out and supported it publicly.
Yeah, it's really wild to look back and think. And it was notable not just that Biden was ahead of Obama, but that he was Irish Catholic. People pointed that out at the time, that he was betraying church orthodoxy on the issue.
Catholic Church, though, it's not particularly powerful at this point, or has it ever been in in American politics?
Historically, no, I don't think the church was really that involved sort of directly in politics. It's nothing like Irish history with the church working with the government to administer social programs. And I'll admit I'm not a huge expert on the history of the U.S. Catholic Church, but I would say, for example, like the church is not part of Kennedy's campaign in 1960. Catholicism is a huge issue in the primaries and in general, but the Catholic Church is not out there organizing the vote or raising money or anything like that. There's a financial issue as well. Churches here are exempt from taxes. But since the 50s, they can lose that status if they engage in political activism. And as of the 80s, that included not just supporting a candidate, but also opposing a candidate. That's actually changed a little bit this year under Trump. But in the 20th century in particular, I think when religion moved politics, it was because of religion rather than the church, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
You know, and now certainly nationally, the church has very little power. There's our Protestant denominations that still move the needle, but not the Catholic Church. But I think even with Irish Catholics who aren't practicing, there is a kind of a vestigial power. There's still some respect that's given. There's a not very good movie called She's the One, which came out in the late 1990s, has a great line on this. And there's two Irish brothers from Long Island. One's getting divorced, and they go to tell their father, who's played by John Mahoney, who played the father on Frasier. Yeah, perfect casting. But he goes nuts. Oh, Catholics don't get divorced. And the brother who's not getting divorced finally stops and he says, why are you getting so upset? You don't even believe in God. And the father replies, he says, that doesn't mean I stopped being a good Catholic. And that's a line that stuck with me, you know, obviously for a long time from a movie that otherwise is quite forgettable because it rung very true to the way that I was raised. And I think even a little bit how my wife and I are raising our daughter. There are a lot of Irish Americans, I think, who are cultural Catholics, even if they're not religious Catholics.
I think, yeah, that's the same here. We're a culturally Catholic country, if not a practicing one, you know. I mean,
Right.
and in America, those Catholics who remain in the church lean right because abortion is still a major issue in the United States.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even the Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Dolan, he's thrown in pretty well with the GOP during the Trump years. That's over abortion and I guess some social issues as well. I mean, after Charlie Kirk was murdered, Dolan compared him to St. Paul, which is quite an honor. But in terms of the congregation, definitely there are single issue voters. The Pew Research Center, which is a respected nonpartisan polling outfit that's been around for a long time, they found that church-going white Catholics went 2-1 for Trump in 2024. That's a big edge.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to put that into context, Trump's best states were like Wyoming and West Virginia. He got just over 70%. So white church-going Catholics are basically as red as southern and rural states where Democrats don't even bother campaigning.
There's some interesting numbers. But beyond abortion, is there something in the political undergrowth going on there with Irish Americans and Trump?
Irish Americans offer an interesting way to get back to the question that you asked before about how you define Trumpism. Because to me, the answer is so obvious that I think I might be missing something, that it's just not universally believed. But from here, Trumpism is simply the inverse of modern American progressivism, right? A modern progressive believes that there are structural inequities in the American system, and it's the job of government and institutions to actively remedy those inequities, right? To help racial minorities, LGBTIA, the underprivileged, people caught up in the criminal justice system, and so on and so forth. And to me, Trumpists believe the exact same thing, and Trump believes the same thing, right? They believe that there are structural inequities in the American system. And in this term in particular, his government has been constantly active in trying to remedy what it sees as those inequities. The obvious difference, though, is that in the Trumpist views, these structural inequalities, they're afflicting essentially the opposite groups of people. So it's not racial minorities, it's white people who are affected by discriminatory DEI woke policies, right? It's not transgender people who need protecting, it's women who are affected by what they would call biological males in bathrooms or in sporting events. It's hardworking taxpayers who are paying for fraud and abuse and people who don't want to work and all these things. So to me, it's on its face not conservative. It's progressivism. It's a philosophy that requires a more active government to fix all these problems.
Irish Americans are absolutely susceptible to Trumpism, as many others are. Like, it's not just an Irish American thing, obviously. But not because they've suddenly turned into fascists and they're going to be down Fifth Avenue instead of Irish dancing down it. You know, they're susceptible because Trumpism, as you described, is, I suppose, progressivism's evil twin. You know, same faith in government power, different list of historically wrong people. Some people will say the system is rigged and, the state must engineer outcomes from oppressed groups. Trumpists say the system is rigged and the state must engineer outcomes for us. It's not small government conservatism. It's a welfare state with a different clientele and a kind of a nastier tone, you know?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's bizarre to me when people ask, is Trump a conservative? I mean, when he accepted the nomination in 2016, he famously said, quote, "I alone can fix it." That's like a cartoon version of what conservatives traditionally thought that liberal presidents believed. But where I think that sense can really appeal to Irish Americans, and where Irish Americans, I think, can highlight Trumpism, it comes from an argument that I've heard multiple times. I'm going back probably 30 years, back to when we were calling racial policy of affirmative action and not DEI. If you're Irish American and you're told, quote, look, we need DEI policies to remedy past racial injustices whose effects still linger, your retort is going to be basically, what did I do? What did we do? My family, probably wasn't even here for slavery. And if they were fleeing a famine. They weren't moving, to Charleston to go buy 10 slaves. My family wasn't a part of Jim Crow. There are very, very few Irish Catholics in the Reconstruction South. In fact, while blacks were being discriminated against, the Irish were being discriminated against too. You can see them online, pictures and classified ads in newspapers that say, quote, Irish need not apply. My ancestors came here with nothing. That's what they're going to say. That's, pretty universally true. And they're going to say that my ancestors came here the right way, which, maybe not quite as universally true, but I suppose the point still holds.
You see a lot of that in social media at the moment. The Irish were treated as bad as slaves. There's, a lot of injustice and all that kind of stuff. Is that a lingering memory of some perceived injustices and stuff, I wonder?
The comparison is a bit overwrought, but there was real tragedy and real prejudice, and the Irish certainly built American railroads. In 2004, archaeologists discovered a mass grave not far from Philadelphia, actually. It held 57 Irish immigrants, all of whom had died out of work camp building the railroad in the 1830s. Earlier this year, they found evidence of another mass grave not too far away. So I think the comparison to slavery is too much, but the Irish did for a long time face very real prejudice here and very real danger here. And for Irish Catholics now, that leads to a simple point. We were victims of discrimination too, so why are we being punished in the process of fixing that discrimination? The broader point, I think, for Irish Catholics is that they're going to ask, if this institutionalized racism that existed, how did I benefit? I didn't. I have no legacy benefits from it, but now when I apply to college or my kids apply to college, when I'm looking for a promotion, other victims of discrimination are going to get this preference. And by the way, when I'm doing all this stuff, the families who did enforce discrimination, who did benefit from them, they're all wealthy. They're all connected. When my kid applies to college, he's going to be competing with African Americans who get preference, but he's also going to be competing with what are known as legacies. So if you apply to Harvard and your father or your grandfather went to Harvard, you get an edge, right? So I'm losing to them too. And I'm really the one, I'm in the middle and I'm getting completely screwed.
Yeah, just, the nature of Trump's grievance politics, isn't it? I mean, and so Trump is fighting against what some Irish Americans might see, as modern discrimination. It says,
absolutely.
You're not privileged beneficiaries of a messy system. You're the new underclass. You're cheated by the elites, like you said there in Harvard or whatever, and pushed aside by other claims to victimhood. It's who can be the bigger victim? Who's the best victim? And unlike actual conservatism, which would tell everybody to kind of calm down, lower taxes, and mind your own business, Trumpism promises to grab the state by the scruff of the neck and use it as your personally bouncer.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that goes back to the idea of Trumpism being the inverse of progressivism, because there's a reason why Trump supporters, and you're on Twitter, you see that all the time. They engage in the same identity politics, the same kind of victimhood farming that, pre-Trump, I think was much more the province of the left. And to your point, not really a part of modern conservatism or the modern Republican Party, even pre-2015.
Would you have any truck with what the Irish American Trump supporters say?
I don't really agree with that. I think it misses some key points. One of the big ones, particularly for somebody who grew up in the Northeast, is that Irish Americans had access to real estate markets in the 1950s. And there's a lot of families who created a lot of wealth that way. And that avenue was closed off to African Americans in particular for most of that time. But the point I would make for this discussion it's not an unreasonable argument. It's an argument that people come by honestly. And, so when Irish Americans are making this argument that things are unfair for us, and I'm going to support Trump because of that, maybe with the acknowledgement that he has a few warts or more than a few warts, as they see it, when they make that decision, well, now they're going to be called racist and fascist and Nazis and everything else. And that just brings cultural war aspects into it too, which again, to the point about Trumpism and progressivism being the same sides of the coin, Trumpists love a good culture war. And there's a lot for Irish Americans in particular to find there. I've heard Irish Americans complain about the use of certain terms like beyond the pale or paddy wagon that they see as offensive to Irish people, that terms that wouldn't be used for other ethnic groups. They would be, politically incorrect, so to speak.
Well, I can tell you now as an Irishman, that, if somebody said you were from beyond the pale these days, it just meant you were from outside Dublin and it wasn't anything offensive. I mean, it means you're from County Kildare or just the arsehole of County Kildare or County Laois or maybe somebody somewhere godforsaken like County Offaly or something like that. I've been known to go beyond the pale a few times myself.
On occasion, the word paddy wagon still gets used. Do you guys know that term?
Yes, we call them paddy wagons here as well.
Yeah, but you guys are all paddies. That's
fair enough. Yeah, we get to say it about ourselves.
One of the arguments here, I guess, which is kind of funny about Irish American history, is that it's actually not offensive. Is that the term paddy wagon actually refers to the people in the front? It refers to the cops driving the wagon, who are all Irish, as opposed to the drunks in the back being all Irish. But look, again, to the point, like for Irish Americans, there's just an underlying unfairness to all of this. As they see it, they did nothing. Irish Americans came here with nothing, built themselves up, and now they're facing unfairness in the economy, and they're being called names because of doing things, quote unquote, the right way.
Yeah, look, this is not limited to Irish Americans, okay? Definitely not. I mean, every nationality has their sense of grievance politics, don't they?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. But I think the Irish and probably the other groups, they used to be called white ethnics, which is Italians, Poles, Eastern Europeans. I think they can probably tell that story a little easier than your average American. But at the same time, the American left, and I would guess probably in Europe as well, I think they just dismiss that too easily. They say, oh, well, J.D. Vance is talking about DEI. That's just a racist dog whistle. And I'm going to be honest, I don't think that's fair. I'm not trying to say that people around the globe are supposed to be feeling sorry for Irish Americans or Italian Americans. But, if you want to understand why Trump's popularity just kind of won't dim, particularly with his base, the simplest reason is that a lot of his supporters have come to a conclusion that the system is rigged against him. And I don't think it's a surprise that many of them support a man who keeps saying over and over that his goal is to break that system.
Yeah, look, I don't think that sense is unique to the United States either. I mean, if you tell an unemployed fella in Ireland who grew up on the wrong side of a factory town that, and a lot of these times, their only company these days is social media. And if you tell him he's part of the oppressor class, he's going to look around his rundown home in the arse end of nowhere and wonder what the hell are you doing.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure.
And enter some Trump-like character shouting into the microphone that the system is rigged and he's going to break it with a gold-plated crowbar. I suppose for people who already feel the system is not just indifferent but hostile towards them, it's not fascism, it's not right-wingism, it's customer service. There's a politician doing what we want, And here's a man who's not talking about healing institutions or restoring norms or civil society, but he's talking about beating the living daylights out of the institutions that have been, in his view, beating the living daylights out of them. That it's far more complex than people kind of are giving it credit for. And I'm prone to blaming social media myself. I'm very prone to that as well, but it's far more complex than that.
I think social media, it certainly amplifies it, but social media is not creating the underlying sentiment. No. I have no doubt that social media whips that sentiment up. Because it really is brilliant at creating that sense of victimhood. You're on Twitter, you see how that goes. One more key point I would add is that his base is not as big as his vote total suggests. Polling in the last 3 elections suggests that Americans kind of hate our presidential candidates. The majority of Americans haven't liked either choice. And so I'm guessing his actual base of supporters is probably closer to 25%. The rest of his votes are coming from people who think he's the least bad option, or at least not quite the country's savior.
And for some people, he's not the country's antichrist either, is it?
Right. No. They see his warts, but they think he's good enough. They still have some level of trust in him. But that core base, of course, still matters hugely to the party, and they basically control the nomination process. So they are hugely influential in American politics. And to your point, they are so loyal because for those supporters, Trump is the only politician who is honestly dealing with how broken the system is and how broken, to be honest, how broken America is.
So there's no other options there, are there?
No. There's, for a lot of people, no. And you will meet people here all the time who believe America is just in a terrible state. You know, to point to Trump's famous slogan, the reason that slogan has been so effective, Make America Great Again, is that there are millions of people who completely agree that the country literally is not great anymore. It used to be great, and now it's not. And if you believe that, in your lifetime, basically, there's been one viable candidate who agrees. And as a result, there's an awful lot that you will put up with, that you're going to tolerate, or that you're going to explain away to keep that candidate in power.
That was quite a downbeat way to end the podcast, but, you know, things could always get worse. So next week, we're going to talk about our country's health services. You know, how about in the United States, Vince, if you don't get insulin, there's a good chance you're going to die.
Yeah, and we're also going to talk about how in Ireland you have to wait 4 months to get to see a doctor when you sprain your toe.
And both are equally true and untrue at the same time, and we're going to parse the differences. So I'm Tull from the Irish Politics newsletter.
And I'm Vince Martin from Wall Street in Maine. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.